High in the mist-covered mountains of Quang Tri Province, U.S. Marines fought a battle the world has almost forgotten. After the bloody siege of Khe Sanh, they weren't given rest. Instead, they were ordered back into the jungle, into an unforgiving war of ambushes, fire bases, and sudden night attacks. For nearly a year, Operation Scotland II pushed the Marines to their limits. They endured brutal losses, faced an enemy that struck like a ghost, and abandoned a base they had once defended with their lives. This is not just another story of the Vietnam War. It's a story of sacrifice, resilience, and the bitter question of what victory really meant in a war with no clear end. Before we dive in, a quick reminder. More than 90% of our viewers aren't subscribed yet. If you enjoy powerful, untold stories from the Vietnam War, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us grow, and it makes sure you never miss the history that deserves to be remembered. Now, let's step into the mountains of Quang Tri Province, April 1968, where Operation Scotland II began. When Operation Scotland II officially began on April 15, 1968, the Marines of the 3rd Division knew their mission would not be easy. The siege of Khe Sanh had just ended, but the hills and valleys around the base were still alive with enemy movement. The PAVN had not retreated far. They used hidden trails and thick jungle to blend into the landscape, waiting for a chance to strike. The Marines moved out from the shattered base in small patrols. Their orders were simple, but dangerous. Search the jungle, locate enemy units, and cut off their supply routes. Every step outside the wire carried risk. The jungle was dense, filled with sharp elephant grass, steep ridges, and tangled roots that slowed movement. Visibility was often no more than a few feet, giving the enemy every advantage in setting traps and ambushes. It did not take long before tragedy struck. Company A of the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, a unit already infamous for its heavy losses, the enemy was disciplined, experienced, and deeply dug into the hills of Quang Tri Province. To succeed, the Marines would have to adapt, moving cautiously, but striking with overwhelming firepower whenever they could find the PAVN. From the very first weeks, Scotland II had shown its true nature. It would not be a single decisive battle, but a grinding test of endurance. One fought in patrols, ambushes, and the lonely outposts scattered across the mountains of northern South Vietnam. By June 1968, the Marines had been fighting in the hills for 2 exhausting months. The ambush of the Walking Dead still weighed heavily on the division, but commanders pushed forward with larger operations to clear the valleys south of Route 9. The most notable was Operation Robin, led by Task Force Hotel, a Marine unit built for aggressive search and destroy missions. For several weeks, companies pushed deep into jungle terrain, uncovering bunkers, supply caches, and well-hidden camps. The fighting was brutal and close. Marines often stumbled into camouflaged positions where the PAVN unleashed sudden bursts of machine gun fire and mortars. To survive, the Marines relied heavily on airstrikes and artillery, which rained down tons of explosives onto suspected enemy positions. The results of Operation Robin were mixed. Official reports claimed 635 enemy killed, compared to 65 Marines lost. On paper, this was a victory, but those numbers came at a price. Every patrol carried the risk of ambush, and every landing zone was a possible trap. Many Marines began to question whether they were truly gaining ground, or simply trading lives in a war of attrition. It was during this same period that a major decision was made. Khe Sanh Combat Base would be abandoned. For months, Marines had sacrificed everything to defend the outpost, enduring artillery bombardments and constant pressure. Yet by July, General Creighton Abrams, who had replaced Westmoreland as commander of U.S. forces, saw the base as a liability. Isolated and costly to supply, Khe Sanh no longer fit the new strategy of mobile operations. In Operation Charlie, the Marines carried out a systematic withdrawal. Bunkers were blown apart, ammunition was destroyed, and the runway was rendered useless. After weeks of bloodshed to defend it, the base that had become a symbol of Marine determination was reduced to rubble. For the men who had fought there, leaving Khe Sanh was bittersweet. On one hand, it freed them from a vulnerable position and gave them the chance to strike more flexibly across Quang Tri Province. On the other hand, many felt they had defended the base with their blood, only to see it abandoned. The decision reflected the shifting priorities of U.S. strategy: mobility over static defense, flexibility over symbolism. The summer of 1968 left a clear message. The Marines were no longer tied to one fortress in the hills. Instead, they would spread out, build new firebases, and continue hunting the enemy in the dense jungles and valleys of northern South Vietnam. But the war in those valleys was far from finished. After the evacuation of Khe Sanh, the Marines entered a new phase of Scotland too. By late summer, the enemy had pulled back into the jungle, and the monsoon rains made large-scale operations almost impossible. To outsiders, it might have seemed quiet. But for the Marines spread across the ridges of Quang Tri Province, the war was still very much alive, just hidden beneath the mist and rain. Patrols continued daily, often slogging through mud that reached up to the knees. The thick vegetation made every step a risk. Booby traps and mines were everywhere, set to slow down even the smallest movements. The enemy rarely showed themselves in force, but when they struck, it was sudden and violent. For Marines walking the trails, the war felt like an endless series of surprises. A sniper shot from the tree line, a grenade rolling out of the underbrush, or a claymore mine detonating without warning. To keep pressure on the PAVN, the Marines built a network of new fire bases. Places like Firebase Neville, Firebase Gurkha, and Firebase Shepherd, along with landing zones such as LZ Mac and LZ Sierra, allowed them to project artillery fire over wide areas. These positions were meant to break the enemy's freedom of movement, creating safe spots for helicopters to land supplies and reinforcements. Yet these strongpoints were lonely and dangerous. Small groups of Marines were isolated on mountaintops, surrounded by jungle. At night, they listened for the sounds of movement beyond the wire, knowing the enemy was always near. Some days passed without a shot fired. Other nights erupted in sudden firefights when PAVN units tested the defenses with probes or mortar shells. By October, sweeps along Route 9 revealed hidden stockpiles of rice, ammunition, and weapons. These discoveries proved that the enemy was not gone. They were simply biding their. January passed with probing attacks on patrols and occasional mortar strikes on fire bases. The Marines sensed that something larger was building. That feeling became reality on the night of February 25, 1969. At Firebase Neville, a mountaintop stronghold manned by a small Marine detachment, the night began like so many others, cold, dark, and tense. Then, just before dawn, enemy sappers slipped through the wire. Carrying explosives and knives, they struck with terrifying precision. The base erupted in chaos as Marines scrambled to defend their positions. Grenades exploded inside bunkers, and satchel charges set fires across the compound. Despite fierce resistance, the attack left deep scars. At least 12 Marines and 2 Navy corpsmen were killed, with many more wounded. Survivors later recalled the confusion of close-quarter fighting in the dark, lit only by explosions and flares. Dozens of enemy sappers were killed in the assault, their bodies left among the wreckage of the wire. The violence did not stop there. On the very same day, Firebase Russell, another Marine outpost nearby, came under a coordinated attack. Mortars and rockets rained down, followed by enemy infantry pressing against the perimeter. Though the Marines held their ground, the attacks proved that the PAVN still had the will and the ability to strike hard, even after nearly a year of relentless Marine operations. For the men on those ridges, February 1969 was a grim reminder. No fire base, no matter how fortified, was beyond the reach of the enemy. Scotland too had shifted again, from the quiet endurance of autumn to a sudden storm of violence that tested every Marine on the line. By the end of February 1969, Operation Scotland II was officially declared complete. It had lasted nearly 11 months, making it one of the longest continuous Marine operations of the war. The toll was heavy on both sides, but the Marines claimed the initiative. For the United States, the price was steep. Reports listed around 435 to 485 Marines killed and more than 2,300 wounded during the course of the operation. These losses reflected the harsh reality of patrolling in hostile terrain, fighting in sudden ambushes, and defending small fire bases against determined attacks. Every ridge and valley seemed to come at a cost in blood. On the other side, American commanders reported that the PAVN had lost over 3,300 soldiers based on body counts collected after engagements. While these numbers were meant to demonstrate success, many Marines on the ground doubted their accuracy. They knew the enemy was skilled at carrying away their dead, and that in many fights it was impossible to count casualties precisely. Still, there was no denying that the PAVN had suffered heavy losses. The Marines also achieved tactical goals. By the spring of 1969, western Quang Tri Province was largely under their control. Patrols and fire bases made it difficult for the enemy to operate openly in the region. Supply caches had been destroyed, infiltration routes disrupted, and several major attacks repelled. When asked to sum up the results, Marine General Raymond Davis stated that his division totally controlled Quang Tri Province. Yet beneath the surface, the picture was more complex. The evacuation of Khe Sanh Combat Base the previous summer had been controversial. To many, it looked like the U.S. had abandoned a fortress that had once been hailed as a symbol of determination. Even with the successes of Scotland II, doubts lingered about whether the sacrifices had been worth it. By March 1969, the Marines could point to hard-won tactical victories and to territory secured. But the enemy was far from gone. The PAVN still moved supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, still rebuilt camps in the Ah Sao and Da Krong valleys, and still looked for chances to strike. Operation Scotland II had ended, but the war in the highlands of South Vietnam was far from finished. Operation Scotland II was more than just another campaign on the long list of Vietnam battles. It marked a turning point in how the Marines fought in the northern provinces, and it revealed both strengths and weaknesses in U.S. strategy. Militarily, the operation showed that fixed strongholds like Khe Sanh were no longer practical. Defending a single isolated base had cost enormous resources during the siege earlier in 1968. By abandoning it in July, U.S. commanders admitted that mobility mattered more than symbolism. Instead of anchoring their fight to one position, the Marines shifted to a web of fire bases and landing zones spread across the hills. This gave them flexibility and allowed artillery to cover wider areas. But it also meant small groups of Marines were scattered in dangerous outposts, constantly exposed to attack. Tactically, the Marines adapted quickly. Patrols became the backbone of Scotland II. Small squads moving through jungle terrain, searching for signs of the PAVN. These patrols often discovered hidden bunkers and supply caches, proving that the enemy was deeply entrenched. But the cost was high. Ambushes like the one that struck the Walking Dead in April 1968 showed how vulnerable Marines could be when isolated in the jungle. Psychologically, the operation carried a heavy weight. Many Marines who had defended Khe Sanh with their lives felt betrayed when the base was abandoned. To them, the bloodshed had been for nothing. At the same time, the Sapper attacks on Firebase Neville and Firebase Russell in February 1969 revealed just how determined the PAVN remained. Even after months of losses, the enemy could still strike with precision and brutality. Politically, Operation Scotland II highlighted the growing disconnect between battlefield realities and American public opinion. At home, people remembered the siege of Khe Sanh because it was dramatic and easy to understand. Scotland II, by contrast, was a grinding campaign of patrols, sweeps, and scattered outposts. Harder to capture in headlines, but no less costly in lives. When the U.S. abandoned Khe Sanh, critics saw it as proof that strategy was shifting with little regard for sacrifice. Strategically, the operation bought time and space. By early 1969, the Marines did hold the upper hand in Quang Tri Province. They had denied the enemy the ability to mass forces in the region. Yet the larger war was unchanged. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained open. The Ah Sao and Da Krong valleys were still contested, and the PAVN showed no sign of giving up. In the end, Scotland II symbolized the Vietnam War itself. Tactical skill and bravery on the ground, set against a larger struggle where victory was never clear. Operation Scotland. Two stretched from April 1968 to the end of February 1969. Almost a full year of constant fighting in the mountains of Quang Tri Province. For the Marines of the 3rd Division, it was a campaign of endurance. They faced ambushes in the jungle, sapper attacks on lonely firebases, and the emotional blow of abandoning Khe Sanh Combat Base, a position that had cost so much to defend only months earlier. The numbers tell part of the story. More than 400 Marines killed, over 2,000 wounded, and thousands of PAVN reported dead. But numbers alone cannot explain what the Marines endured. For the men on the ground, Scotland 2 was not about statistics. It was about surviving patrol after patrol, holding fire bases through the night, and carrying the memory of friends lost in sudden bursts of violence. On a tactical level, the Marines could point to success. Western Quang Tri Province was firmly under U.S. control by March 1969. Supply routes had been disrupted, enemy caches destroyed, and large attacks repelled. Marine General Raymond Davis proudly declared that his division totally controlled Quang Tri Province. In the short term, this was true. Yet the war was larger than any one province. The Ho Chi Minh Trail kept the enemy supplied, and the Ah Sao and Da Krong valleys remained gateways for infiltration. The Sapper raids at Firebase Neville and Firebase Russell proved that the PAVN could still strike anywhere, even in areas the Marines claimed to dominate. In the end, Operation Scotland 2 was both a victory and a reminder of the war's complexity. The Marines had fought with skill and courage, but the strategic question of Vietnam remained unanswered. What did it mean to control a province if the enemy could return at will? What was the value of holding a base one month, only to abandon it the next? For the Marines who lived it, Scotland 2 was not an abstract operation. It was the defining year of their lives, a year of sacrifice, of brotherhood, of victories paid for with blood. Their story deserves to be remembered, not just as a chapter in military history, but as a symbol of the human cost of a war that offered no easy answers.